In Islam, Prophet Muhammad is described as al-Ummiyin, which is commonly retranslated as the illiterate, or more commonly translated as the unlettered in Sunnah.com. According to this belief, Muhammad did not read or write, and this is why the Quran was revealed to him orally. When it comes to Muslim tradition, however, we find that Muslims assert that his inability to read or write shows that the Quran could not have been from his own composition. It was by that reasoning they called it a divine miracle. However, great minds like the late Christian apologist Nabil Qureshi approached this claim critically. Qureshi explained that he eventually left Islam after asking himself what reason is there to stand by the Quranic claims about Jesus, a historical figure, when all other records disagree. The Quran was written 600 years after Jesus and 600 miles away. This critique from Nabil Qureshi is one of the biggest problems Islam has. If the content from the Quran is from an all-knowing God, then why does it often cite or borrow from earlier legends that predate Islam? Islam as a whole has borrowed a lot from paganism that flourished within surrounding regions from Mecca. Surrounding regions had their own Kaabas, and in fact Muhammad competed with them. In other words, the words of Allah in the Quran are far more characteristic of a created creature of 7th century Arabia than of an omniscient perfect being. For example, Jesus lived in a time when slavery, murder, sexual immorality, and polygamy, in other words, in a culture where widespread unrighteousness was common, yet Jesus never endorsed nor participated in any of it. In contrast, Muhammad's God often permitted or regulated such actions or practices. More than that, the content we find in the Quran is oftentimes repeated nonsense from earlier legends like mentioned before. These legends were floating around in Arabia during Muhammad's time. For example, there are Talmudic references in the Quran and even fraudulent writings that appear almost word for word. Take, for example, the infancy Gospels, all of which were known to be fraudulent and claimed to be written by people like Thomas or James, who are apostles of Jesus, nearly 4 centuries after their deaths. The infancy Gospels contained stories like Jesus doing miracles at young ages, and you would have guessed it, these same stories are being referenced directly in the Quran, where Jesus makes birds out of clay and when he speaks as a babe in the cradle. These stories originated in the fraudulent infancy Gospels and are clearly borrowed. We even have tafsirs from Ibn Kathir plainly admitting that these stories were brought to light when a debate occurred between Muhammad and Gnostic Christians from Najran. The Quran presents these legends that the Gnostics brought to Muhammad as divine fact, as if Allah himself is endorsing them, even though the sources are clearly fraudulent. In other words, the Quran treats human-forged stories as revelation. Another thing that has to be said is there are clear similarities between Islam and pre-Islamic beliefs. The Kaaba was adopted straight from the pagans that surrounded that region into Islam. There were multiple Kaabas in pre-Islamic Saudi Arabia or the Arabian Peninsula that Muhammad competed with. Not to mention the black stone has much similarities with idols that predated Islam, like figures mentioned directly in the Quran. In Surah 53 ayah 19 we are told that one of these idols at the Kaaba was named Alat. And the Islamic tradition offers quite the context. If you go to Ibn Kathir's tafsirs, it tells us that Alat was a crane god that was a white stone that would intercede for the believers. Similar, the black stone intercedes for the believers on the Day of Judgment, according to Islamic tradition of the Hadiths. There are a lot of stones in the desert interceding for people. Even the forms of superstition that Muhammad engaged in, like the evil eye, was adopted from paganism. In previous works of mine, I have brought this up. Muhammad, much like later paganism that arose shortly after Jesus, formerly in the work of Plutarch, where you can cause harm to someone by a mere glance of the eye due to jealousy or envy. Muhammad prescribes to this and was associated with it before Islam was a thing. Traditions say that Muhammad's mother Amina would use witchcraft to rid Muhammad of pagan curses, specifically in this case known as the evil eye. And even later, Muhammad dictates the Quran to say that the evil eye is real. For instance, in chapter 68 verse 51, where we're told that with a mere glance of an eye, disbelievers can cause Muhammad to stumble. So even the Quran adopted this Plutarchian ideology. I can go on and on and on and on and it never ends. But that is why it is a serious and a big problem. The main claim for their religion is that since Muhammad was illiterate, how did he know who Jesus or Moses was, or any other religious figure predating him? But if we analyze these claims, every time it comes up that he borrowed fraudulent stories of these individuals, from the Syriac version of Alexander the Great, to the 7 sleepers, to the evil eye, to the Gnostic Gospels, he got everything wrong and fails each and every test given to him. So even though the Quran may mention Noah, or Abraham, or Ishmael, or Moses, or Jesus, or John the Baptist, or any other religious or historical figure, the truth is Muhammad was acquainted with many Jews and Christians of various sects And we even have Christians and Jews saying Muhammad knows nothing but what they have taught him in hadith. And what they taught him must have been seriously false information. For instance, Muhammad got all the previous scriptures all wrong in the Quran. If we're judging the Quran based off of what our scripture tells us, like the Quran tells us to, then we come to the conclusion that the Quran contradicts the entirety of the Bible each and every single time. Not only in doctrine, but also in history. For example, in the Quran, Noah had a fourth son who refused to enter the ark, and he eventually drowned in the flood. The Quran then goes on to say that Abraham was to sacrifice Ishmael instead of Isaac. Another crazy thing is when Abraham and Ishmael built the Kaaba together, which is a pagan temple, which had 360 idols when Muhammad was born in Mecca. Another big contradiction is when Moses gets adopted by Pharaoh's wife instead of his daughter. And worst of all, the Quran says that the golden calf was built by a Samaritan 7 centuries before Samaritans even existed. In Surah 19 verse 28, Mary, the mother of Jesus, is confused with Miriam, the sister of Aaron and Moses. These are only a few of the contradictions between the Quran and the Bible, showing that the Quran is surely not divinely inspired by its own tests. This is why the Quran fails, because it was merely dictated by a 7th century Arabian creature, not a timeless God, because Islam is a product of a 7th century Arabian man, aware of local customs and regional religions. The Quran is, like I said, essentially a product of not only the author's time, but a product of the author. Muhammad dictated a law as if Allah was on Muhammad's leash, and even Aisha knew this when she said, "It seems as though your God hastens to your needs."